The following was extracted from the Bristol-Courier-Times Newspaper. From an article, written by Paul Altaire, Courier-Times Staff Writer. The article was published on June 10, 1963.
A child stares up at the blank white ceiling, above his hospital bed, and a tear trickles down from the corners of his eye, as he thinks of the outside world and the fun it holds. Another child, lying in a bed beside him, tries to shift her head slowly, despite the pain, just to look at the other children, who, like herself, must remain confined. Everyone is wonderful to the children at Shriners Hospital on Roosevelt Boulevard. The doctors, the nurses, and most of all, the Shriners themselves, who have seen to it that they get the care they need, whatever the cost, whatever their family's financial status, whatever the color of their skin, whatever their religion. And yet, though their world is sad and lonely, it is not all filled with tears. Sometimes the children laugh, and laugh, and laugh, and all the tears are gone. Only the joy of fun remaining in their hearts, to talk about for weeks and weeks. All thanks to two Trevose women, who one day read an article about puppets.
Mrs. Raymond Schmale, left, and Mrs. James Swann of Concord Park, Trevose, co-producers of the Wonderland Puppet Theater, take a curtain call with some of the dozens of puppets, which bring laughter and hope to the saddened hearts of children who need UNICEF help.
It all started early last spring, when Mrs. James Swann of 4432 Buckfield Terrace and her neighbor, Mrs. Raymond Schmale of 4412 Buckfield Terrace, both Concord Park housewives, read an article by Bil Baird, famous for his Baird puppets. That started the two women thinking. And the more they thought about it, and talked about it, with others, the more enthusiastic they became, about starting a puppet show of their own. Nothing big, nothing professional. Just a little something, to bring fun to the neighborhood children, and maybe, if it worked out, to other children who needed the best medicine in the world, laughter. Soon Mrs. Swann, and Mrs. Schmale, found their ranks growing as they started to make plans. Taking an enthusiastic hand in the project were Mrs. Feg, of Langhorne, a teacher in the Neshaminy School District, Mrs.Lawrence, a teacher at Lafayette School in Bristol Township, John Kriebel, who taught at Newtown Friends School, and who was now working for his doctorate at the University of Pennsylvania. Others joining the would-be puppeteers were Mrs.Wheeler of Concord Park, Frank Hare of 4443 Somerton Road, a piano and voice teacher who wrote the music for the group's first production, and Mrs.Mimms, another housewife in Concord Park. Each of the group pitched in, some doing legwork, others planning the production, still, others helping Mrs. Swann with her task of making the puppets. And finally, after weeks of preparation, the first public showing in Mrs. Hare's backyard. As the curtain descended on the final act of the first show, 150 children and adults cheered wildly and excitedly, asking for more. And that was the beginning. Since then the show has grown to larger and longer productions, with other enthusiasts joining the group, including Frank Pinio, a supervisor in the sheltered workshop of the Pennsylvania Association for Retarded Children, Philadelphia, Mrs. George Hadley, a housewife at 2921 Sussex Road, Trevose, and Mrs. Mrs.Bietel, another housewife at 4402 Buckfield Terrace. The co-producers, Mrs. Swann and Mrs. Schmale, and their volunteer road company, moved their production to the Byberry Friends meeting at the Byberry State Hospital grounds. Another showing was given in Ivyland, for the Ivyland PTA, and then finally, at Shriners Hospital. All free to whoever wanted to see it. Expenses kept mounting. Costumes, scenery background, and incidentals came to more than the group could afford. Donations had come from those who were taking part in the show, but how could they be expected to continue this, Mrs. Swann and Mrs. Schmale wondered. The group got together, and talked it over, and came up with the answer. The show would go anywhere in Pennsylvania they were wanted, and in return, all the group asked for was a donation from the private group requesting a performance. Only actual expenses would be deducted from the donations. The balance would go to UNICEF. And so, such puppet shows as The Magic Onion, The Sorcerer's Apprentice, and others, lasting 45 minutes or more, will be visiting more and more communities. Free to hospitals and other institutions, by donations from private groups and organizations with the funds going to help others. Now, with many more puppets, plus a new stage made by Mr. Pinio and Mrs. Hare, the group is planning, through its ambitious approach, on bringing smiles of wonder to local children and smiles to the children who receive UNICEF.